One of the things that makes comparative media studies so difficult or so challenging is that the effects or the impacts of a medium aren't just given in that medium per se. When you look at media and all the different effects that they seem to have not only, quotes, different effects on different people, but there are systematic effects that seem to be based upon what kind of exposure those people have had to previous media. Yeah, it gets really complicated. There's all kinds of transactions that go on. Now, there's different examples. I mean, Marshall McLuhan noted that literacy gave a kind of protection or immunization against the effects of radio, and that radio has a radical tribalizing effect on oral peoples in a way that literate peoples can detachedly hear radio as entertainment in a way that wholly oral peoples cannot. It has a rallying effect. Now, McLuhan also suggests, there's a great line where he says, Johnny can't read not because Johnny can't read, but because Johnny can't imagine long-term goals. This is an interesting line. I think what McLuhan saw was that the electric age was an age of instant gratification. Instant gratification is one of the key messages of the electric media. And to say that is to say that there is a kind of sensibility about goals, about long-term goals, short-term goals, and those get changed as a different medium comes to dominance, and it's changing. Its impact or its effect is different upon different people depending upon what previous media they've had, right? So I think part of the problem is that the drift from people who lived in what could be called more oral residue or farmland, nature, wilderness, commune with nature and silence and nature sounds, there is a kind of timelessness to that. When literacy hits, and literacy comes to mean long-term goals, long-term time binding, writing for keeping a record for the future, that is, the eternal gets substituted for the now ancient and the distant future or something like this. Time binding becomes very different as people learn to write and as they learn to embrace text. But I think that is very different than the kind of timelessness that's now being ushered in by what we take to be the digital age or the modern age. This digital age, modern age, doesn't have the same timeless quality. That it's not a return. I think some people say, oh, in McLuhan's terminology of the return of the global village, and it's the village at a global scale. And McLuhan then defended himself and said, oh yes, what have more harsh butchers than the savagery of the global village. But I think he himself would have been very concerned about the difference between what we now call the timeless and what used to be the sense of the timeless. I think the timeless today, the eternal Ethernet, the space of non-space that is online eternality, it's an insatiable eternality. It's not the same order as natural ebb and flow of desire in the world. It's an artificial one. That is, until you can actually eat a poem that comes through the internet, it's going to be caught in a capitalist hell of hyper-commercialization and super insatiability logics, whereas the natural world will always have genuine distances that need to be overcome, and as they're overcome, things at a distance can maintain a kind of value. satiation you can experience satiation in the natural world. You can be too full. You can be hungry and need more, like literally. Whereas the appetite for digital environment is somehow removed from that. It's an insatiable capitalist environment. It seems to be. Um, we can imagine it to be open source, but we say it's open source, and I think the logic of its open source is trying to mask how much of it absolutely is independent or is radically dependent upon capitalist infrastructure of interests that are other than communal barter trade, partly because you can't eat anything electronic. It's not part of our metabolism in the way that the natural surrounding environment is. So I think the point here, long digressive point, is that the kinds of effects of a communication medium cannot be understood in terms of just what the medium does, and they can't be even understood in terms of what the medium does to individual bodies. Part of the difficulty or challenge is that different bodies already have been accustomed to certain kinds of orientations that then when that medium hits and comes to dominance, it alters already altered, right, already adapted sensory ratio balances, spatiotemporal orientations, life goals, sensibilities. So right now, for example, I think the highly literate folks have somewhat of an immunity to the onslaught of the visual age in a way that young people who have not yet built up those defenses may be more susceptible to visual magic. That is, they may not yet have sufficiently equip themselves to defend themselves against the visual onslaught. The same could be said of right now as various communication technologies come into dominance in young people's lives. If they don't have other kinds of grounding in these other forms of pre-technological communication, I'm not sure if they're aware of the historical context enough to have defenses. I think McLuhan's work is so rich partly because he had such a breadth of history, such a comprehension of historical depth, that allowed him to see the fact that different media, right, have different impacts on different folks depending upon the other kinds of media that they've already been exposed to. So, okay, hopefully that made sense. Thanks.